Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Bahman Yazdonfar, and this is Turnaround, the weekly program brought to you by my colleague John Hardy and I to discuss different elements of the human interaction when it comes to our behaviors and the result and productivity that we could produce in a workplace or in an organization or environment. During last 5 or 6 weeks, we touched on a number of the issues, from the habits, from the psyche of understanding each other when we come to close interaction with each other. And even last week we were talking about how we can get I think John specifically spoke about how we can get away from the crowd thinking if we want to, and how we stay out. So this week we are going to elaborate on that, on the technique or the way that we can do that, about how not to be part of the troopers, as John called them. John?
Hi, Bowman.
Hello.
So, yeah, I think
am I again off?
Well, no, once again, you framed the conversation beautifully, so that we can take it in any direction from there.
Any direction. Okay, I hope it is a good direction for our audience.
It will be. I mean, I'm sure they're bound to enjoy it.
Okay.
I was thinking about that. Yeah, exactly. What is it that distinguishes let's say the player or the outsider from the trooper? In a way, I think it's in relation to the shadow, right?
What shadow are we talking about?
So we're talking about the shadow. It's like, in a way, what is your shadow? It's that part of yourself that you don't wish to see. Right?
Okay.
And I was thinking
so are
that,
demons?
We could say it's demons, but I think in a way, that the way they're created is as simple as, if you've got all these traits that you're born with, and we have a certain predisposition in some areas other than others. I don't think it's absolutely neutral. But then our parents usually, or that which is around us, basically emphasizes certain traits. So you're going to be this, and the moment you're this, you're not that, right?
That's correct.
So the moment you're this, that category is a very small one, and the not category is, of course, much larger, right? Because you're not this, 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 and this. So if you're yellow, you're not red, you're not blue, you're not green, et cetera, right? So what then happens is that the more we get tied into being this, which is the ego,
which is the
persona,
the one that was dictated by our parents.
Well, the environment, our parents, to some extent, our own character fits
It's not
in.
the one that you are born with. We are talking.
Not exactly.
Okay.
Now,
Okay.
it can't be completely different in the sense that you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear completely, but it's going to be very different, or at the very least, it'll be a very small subset of that which you are. Okay.
Okay.
So the moment you're now vested in this, you're equally. This then really becomes defined as not this.
Okay.
So that the way the ego thinks is, let's say, in terms of perfection, is what is perfection? It's an absence of imperfection. So the focus is not on this thing which is perfection so much as all these things which are not perfection is where the focus lies. So it becomes really very much of a negative focus. It's very constrictive. And I think that's exactly the box where the trooper lives their lives.
If that person in this scenario would not or did not have the instruction from his or her parents and follow his or her where his or her predisposition was, would it be the same scenario?
No doubt it wouldn't.
So there wouldn't be a not perfection part?
I mean, it wouldn't be nearly as severe. So let's say I can imagine that the more sophisticated a society becomes, the more hierarchy there is in the society, the higher you are up in the society, the more defined this persona becomes, right?
I'll give you an example. Yeah. Maybe it helps you to, then you can elaborate on that. When all my teenage years, all of my high school, I always was interested in maths and the problem solving, and something involve challenge, mentally especially. And by the time when I got 18 or 19, 18 years old, my father comes to me one day and says, well, I want you to go and become a doctor. I never had any interest in biology. I never had any interest in that field. But I went there. Now, if the part that you said when you are being directed in one direction rather than what you're naturally supposed to, I understand that part that you try to do a little bit better over there, but always there is a gap or
There's
vacuum. There is a emptiness in one part.
That
now,
can be.
Are we
yes.
talking about that shadow, or are we talking about the shadow of if I did perfect it, what my, let's say, daddy told me?
I would say it's more, the worst case is where you're actually, it doesn't happen to people so much anymore, but happened in the past, is that you're a son of a carpenter, you're going to be a carpenter regardless of what you are, right? So this becomes your identity, and now your identity is even at odds with your nature, right?
Okay.
That's a worst case. But even if it's something that falls within your nature, it's going to be a small subset of your nature, right? So let's just say you love medicine, and you want to be a doctor, and fine, you become a doctor. But within society, doctors seen a certain way. There's a whole kind of status accorded to it, whole behavior associated with it. Now, in some ways that will conform to you, but in other aspects it won't. There will be some parts of your character that will not behave the way a doctor would behave, right?
Based on the standards of the society.
Yeah, whatever that standard was, right? And therefore, they will be deemed to be inappropriate.
Okay.
Not just by society, but ourselves.
Okay.
To the extent that we buy in it. Then we have to suppress them.
Okay.
And it's in our suppressing them. This requires a lot of psychic energy. A lot of energy is invested in this.
Yeah, because it takes more time to
exactly
confine something rather than just.
And I think this becomes, that tension is the tension of the game. It's exactly that. That's the suppression. That's the pressure. And so that's an example is, let's say, when people experience collapse, right? Where you lose everything. The experience of when you just get taken down completely in something like let's say financially, right? Your whole career goes. You've experienced the greatest pain just before the end, probably, right? Where you're desperately hanging on, trying one thing or another, willing to do anything. But there comes a certain point where you just know you're going down, right? There's nothing you can do.
Yeah.
Whether it's your fault or not, you're done, right?
It's like if someone is sinking.
Yeah, you're sinking, you're
drowning
sunk.
in the water.
At that point, right?
Yeah.
What you actually experience instead of pain is release. You experience like a surrender. And interestingly enough, at that point is when you realize, it's only at that point that you realize that that thing that you were holding on to was something that was not you, it was just this idea, right? But it was the idea of you that, in my case, when it happened to me, I bought into that idea. I bought into that whole thing without even knowing that I bought into it because I was living inside it, right?
Okay.
So because these people live inside this, so for instance, an example is people, like when it comes to altruism, for instance, people basically need to feel that almost all their behaviors are, the motivation is noble, right? They're helping out a friend, it's all noble. The idea that there would be some aspect of it that's less than noble, right? Even though that's, in almost every case, this is very largely true, right?
There is some sort of self-satisfaction somehow.
Or there's even a kind of vicarious sabotage. There can be all kinds of things going on, right?
That's correct.
Underneath the surface. But what happens is that even though people know that this is part of human nature, when it comes to themselves, the idea that this could be true of them, or for instance, cowardice, right? Now, who basically faces every fear, every time, right? Who can be uniformly courageous all the time? I mean, maybe there's some of us, very few. Even those who we deem to be courageous, are
They have certain fears.
they have
somewhere.
fears, or they have moments maybe where they were cowardly.
Yeah.
Not often, and they are. And it's not to minimize what they've done, but probably they actually are much more accepting of their own cowardice than anybody else is. That the hero can afford to accept his moments of cowardice, right? In the sense of not accept it as something he'll do in the future, but accept that it happened, right?
But even that is not cowardice. Cowardice is when you lie about it, about what you do.
Okay,
Yeah.
this is true too,
Yeah.
but let's just say that even their acts of, sort of less than noble, less than fear, when they ran, in the face of danger, or something happened,
Okay.
right? Or they didn't behave as they wish they would have. But someone who is capable of behaving courageously has the strength to look at the times when they didn't, right? But those people who don't behave courageously by course, which is the majority, are the ones who can't in any way engage with the idea that they're less than courageous. Because they're more frightened of their own cowardice than they are of the enemy.
Well, it contributes to two elements. One is a lack of information or ignorance one side. Another is vanity, that they think that whatever I do is correct based on the perception of the society.
Well, and the fact that they need to believe that. So what happens is that those people who are in that, right? What happens is that, let's say in the game, if we look at the game as being sort of a necessary part of life that you have to engage,
Yes.
then ultimately it's like the person's shadow is there like a 50-pound weight that they're lugging around in a battle. Is that if you don't have this shadow, you can move, you can do all kinds of things.
To protect you from
No, exactly.
Exposing that weak side of them, or even spending some energy to keep it the way it is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
So what ends up happening is that if you, for instance, if you're engaging with the other person, and you know that person's shadow, and you don't, and they have no hook into your shadow because of the fact that whatever they say about you, you couldn't care less, right? You've got a huge advantage in that interaction, emotionally. That emotionally you can devastate them, you can move them, you can do all kinds of things, essentially, in terms of the impact. Even if your position in the game, economically or whatever, is weak, you're in a very, very strong position in the interaction. Whereas for those people who are, have this image they have to protect, even though they can be very high in the game in the sense of having great status, etc., now they have to build fortresses around themselves because of the fact that now they're even more exposed. The higher they go up, the more they are exposed to someone finding out their shadow because they're more visible. And in fact, their shadows have grown because they've done more acts which are cowardly. Because an example is you're going up in the organization, right? Basically, when the players are in charge, what do they want from the drones essentially is loyalty. One of the ways they make sure of loyalty is they make sure that these people are willing to do anything that's required. And they'll test them.
Yeah,
Because
or get them involved in their own scenes.
And and complicit because
Yeah.
that's the way you can hold somebody. Well, the more somebody goes into that,
It's like
the
a
higher-
gang mentality.
Yeah, and the higher they go up, the more they're vested into it. And now when you get a class of people like that, it's almost like they're in this kind of mutual admiration society, which is actually a mutual delusion society, where I'm going to pretend to see you as a hero while you pretend to see me as a hero, when subconsciously we both know exactly what we are.
Which we discussed in Mutual Admiration
Right?
Society.
And we got all of that.
Yeah.
And so what happens is that as much as that is the anchor that's holding everybody in, you break free of that anchor and you know how to use it, which in a way is the position of the alpha player.
There was a great line in a movie that I saw when I was 16, 15, maybe. It was Bruce Lee,
What, Enter the Dragon?
Enter the Dragon, and
A great philosophical piece.
Very good. But at the beginning
Defining.
at the beginning of the movie, when they are recruiting this Bruce Lee character to go to that
Yeah.
island to represent CIA or whatever was that, he was talking to one of his masters, and the master said, when you look at the enemy, don't look at it as an enemy. even if it is like a tiger, I'm just paraphrasing, if you tear that image, you find the real motive. And then you can defeat them.
Yeah,
So what you are saying it is again that image. And for instance, when I was younger, for many years, I was always flabbergasted by reading news, and they went to arrest someone in very high position, and he shot himself. I said, why? I mean, you have money, you have power, they get you, you get a lawyer or something like that. What is it? Now, later on, when I got into the philosophy, I said, that's psyche, because that man preferred to be dead than lose his image.
And it's and that man ultimately was subsumed by his ego.
Yeah,
because the ego would have been destroyed.
And the cowardness comes to the fact at that moment of his or her life. So actually, most of the people who commit suicide in that situation were male, I believe. I don't recall any woman has done it. But in general, so how it helps in knowing that, how it helps to get out of that, to get that shadow. First of all, you have to recognize what shadow are you dragging.
First of all, you realize it's just like, we all have the same shadows. So for instance, it's like, even like say, like what are the biggest shadows we have? Let's say like sexual fantasies. We think of, whatever.
Sexual fantasies are shadow?
Yeah, well, in a sense.
Why is that?
Well, no, if you think of it.
Let's say it is for audience will be very interesting subject.
If you were to actually take a look at most people, the last thing they would actually, share is their sexual fantasy, whatever it was, right?
Not necessarily. Fantasies. No, I thought you said sexual experience. Sorry.
No, experience is possible, but it might be okay. But in terms of their fantasies, in terms of their hidden fantasies that they don't want to share, that really reveal
because they are afraid of being judged,
but ultimately their own judgment, because they judge they deem these characteristics of themselves to be unacceptable, right?
So they know that is wrong.
Well, it's not even that they're wrong, right? But what they feel it's wrong is because it's actually representative of the opposite what they allow themselves to be. So in other words, somebody, let's just say, is very dominant.
The standards they have for themselves does not match that fantasy.
Exactly. Like an example would be, somebody would be, let's just say, very dominant in the world. Let's just say they have a fantasy of being submissive, okay? Whatever. Now, to somebody who's dominant in the world, that would be actually particularly unacceptable, right?
And
shameful and not wanting. At the same time, what are they experiencing it as? They think, wow, this is weird, I'm a pervert, I'm strange, etc. At the same time, if they were to actually, be on Mars and had some kind of X-ray where they could look at people's minds, they would see, and in fact, if you even look at pornography, you're seeing the same fantasies right across the board, right?
Yeah.
That if you take a look across the whole web, there's only a limited number of fantasies which...
And all of them, that means someone else in Japan or in Germany or in England has thought about it long time ago.
No, precisely. No, but not only that, there's not even such a wide variety because they fall into certain categories, right? Now, so, and they're even cataloged, this, and this. So the interesting thing is that they're not even remotely unique. They're just sort of a natural reaction of this process of emphasizing one thing, which then suppresses the other, right?
Okay.
Now the thing is that to the extent that that person experiences that shame, right? That shame is an indication of their buying in to this ego fantasy that they are, right?
What shame are we talking about?
In other words, the shame towards the fantasy.
Internally.
Yeah.
Not shame in external. Okay.
No, their fame, their experience of shame, right?
Yeah.
That they don't want to share it, right?
Okay.
Embarrassment, right? That then becomes the vehicle, and this is exactly how spies are caught. For instance, when they with the where they seduce, let's say the Russians used
like
to do this all but when the Russians used to do this all the time with the Brits, where they catch them with temptresses or dominatrixes or whatever it is, and then they capture them in this kind of loop situation where they're being blackmailed, and then they're induced to do all kinds of compromising things, and once they've done it, then they cross the line and they've got them, right? And so now they've gone from doing things that they don't really have a real basis for being embarrassed about, to doing things which they really should be embarrassed about because of the fact that
Yeah,
they're actually they're actual
criminal activity. Actually.
criminal activities and treachery, right?
Yeah.
They've even the highest crime, which is treason, right? Okay. So the thing though is, what is the hook? Always is, it's our shame. It's that which we're ashamed of. So that's the thing that we actually have to look at, because that's the clue. It's the way. How do we free ourselves from the game? Is to look at our shame.
Okay, let's say,
Or the object of our shame, for instance.
Okay, let's
for
say,
anybody.
Yeah, I can understand. For instance, if there is a CEO of the company or a president or a prime minister or whatever, has certain shadow.
Yeah.
Let's say in this case that you discussed, sexual fantasy that has not to be revealed, and he or she keeps it for themselves.
Right.
By even disclosing that, maybe lose the authority among the people who work for it, because
Now that's a practical consideration.
That is practical. So that is maybe that put it in the consideration as well. Now,
but that's a separate thing.
Yeah, I understand. What I'm asking is that person, if he wants to get rid of that shadow, are you suggesting that come out and just explain it to public?
No, it has nothing to do with the relationship to the public. It has to do with his relationship with his own shadow.
But it is
himself.
Related to the public regardless.
No, that's almost secondary. That's a practical consideration, because of the way the game is played and everything like that. If you were to declare that, of course, for practical reasons, it would be a disaster. That's one thing. But the point, the thing which is the emotional thing, and which actually creates the fixation in the first place.
For himself.
Yeah. The thing that actually keeps that, what is deemed as a perversion, in place, is the shame of it.
Okay.
So it's creating like a lock.
Okay.
If he's able to, or she, or him, but let's say here it's more typically males who have this, I think, actually just engage.
Males are dogs.
So engage with whatever it is, right? Just as a reality. Not something to be proud of, ashamed of, but just as an is. Something that exists, right?
Okay.
It basically breaks the emotional charge, because what holds something in place is an emotional charge. And the emotional charge is this tension, this denial, this negative association. But if it's just seen objectively as just a phenomenon, and then he asks the question, well, where does this phenomenon come from? It's not just me, it's other people too. And then wondering, well, perhaps it came from my childhood, etc. And he just starts to explore it as like an objective
investigation,
right?
Yeah, investigative process. Yeah.
Once you start to do that, immediately what you're doing is you're doing two things. First of all, you're taking the air out of the balloon. You're weakening the energy which is holding it in place.
Okay.
And also what's happening at the same time is you're breaking this ego conceit, because while I'm deflating this being so bad, I'm also
releasing a space for the other things. Yeah.
I'm also deflating the idea that I'm so great.
Oh,
same time, right?
Well, that is possible, yes.
Right, because this is the real problem.
You are just explaining the concentration that we discussed, that I had that.
Well, this would be an example of example of it, right? That as this starts to collapse, this starts to collapse too. That you don't need to see yourself as so great, right? You don't need to believe yourself as something special. So an example of this, let's say, Dana, I was picking up from my daughter from the school, taking her to a medical appointment. And so it's a school that I went to, it's a junior high, go in there. Back in those days, I would just walk in and out, etc. Now, the school's locked, you need a buzzer, etc. Okay.
You have to verify yourself.
Then you go in, verify yourself. But the whole atmosphere of the office, of the way the secretaries talk to us about the rules and getting a particular slip and everything, I felt like basically I was in, Stalag 13, like in some sort of concentration camp or prison camp or something, right?
Yeah.
So what's happened is
you enter to the KGB.
Yeah, but no, but think about this. It's on the one hand, under the guise of protecting us, what we have is a bunch of these alpha drones there in the office feeling very important about themselves.
Godly,
right?
godly.
And godly, right?
Yeah.
About a bunch of rules, creating an atmosphere which now will pervade the whole school. Okay, now if we drill down into one of those individuals, right?
Okay.
Who just happens to be that third secretary at the third desk who's just sitting there very, smugly safe, right? If we
Who
start
thinks it makes a big difference to the world?
well, no, exactly. But you take a look at that. If you were to take a look at that person's mental set, how they see the world, they've got this whole bunch of rules and regulations which they need to be in place because that keeps them feeling safe and important, and feeling that they're adhering to this rule in such an officious and obnoxious way is somehow serving humanity, and they're even seeing themselves as martyrs, right?
Yeah.
Now,
Or heroes.
You can imagine then that as well, when so much is invested in this false image, that on the other side, this could very easily be a person, if you were to imagine their sexual fantasies, right? Such a person who is so oppressive and so limiting in terms of what they allow themselves to be in the world, you can just imagine what they would be on the other side. You can just imagine what they're suppressing, right? And it's that suppressing tension which is creating and fueling the viciousness.
This behavior.
Exactly, and that's what I'm getting at, and that's the dynamic.
But the question is here, like we discussed a couple of weeks ago, before you want to get, let's say, in this discussion that we have today, that shadow, or
Yes.
we want, as you call it, deflating that shadow, in order to have subsequent deflation of your ego.
That's right.
Subsequently. First, you have to recognize it, and second, you have to have a willingness to bring it down. In the case of this scenario that you just explained, that third office person sitting there,
Third clerk,
the clerk, does he or she or does this wants to do that?
Actually, I think this is where it becomes the desire. Yes, is there for everybody.
How can you be sure?
No, I think it is just because of the fact that it's a tension and it's not what we are, and therefore on some level we wish there's a natural desire deep down to be what we are.
Okay.
However, what gets in the way, and I think that's what's important, what gets in the way of this natural desire?
Ego.
Well, okay, it's the ego, but what's defending the ego is fear, right?
Well, of course, fear of that shame and the fantasy or whatever.
In the end, of everybody around them too, because their attitude towards the world will be not one of an optimistic one; it will be a pessimistic one, right? Because they're going to be projecting this inner landscape out into
the
the world.
energy can just spread itself in the environment.
That's right,
of
but
course.
that's the way it does it, is through this projection. So it also it then induces them to see the world as a dangerous place because of that which they have now deemed dark within, and they're projecting it out. So all of these things are happening simultaneously. And so I'd actually say that what would cause it, I think it becomes, if the environment is all of a sudden shifted to one where, for instance, let's just say that there was a different kind of principle, and that bit by bit what they started to do was relax these rules. Now, I'm not saying it's up to the principal in today's system, but imagining that it was, right?
Just for this example.
Hypothetically, let's say it's a private school, right?
Yeah.
And let's just say that somehow or other this person was gradually allowed to relax this need. And in the meantime, other aspects of her character were reinforced, where the person was complimented on their ability to do something, like, for instance, how nice those flowers that you brought in, the arrangement that you just did, right? Something, some aspect of themselves. So if that other aspect of themselves, which somehow is special to them, was and truly is them, not what other people wish them to be, but represents who they truly are, if that was then focused upon, then what happens is it's where the attention goes. That's where attention starts to go, and as attention starts to go there, the need to hold the attention to keep themselves safe diminishes.
So it is a process of distraction or
It's a virtuous cycle that you're creating.
replacement, like a habit. When you have one habit, you wanted to get rid of it, you replace it with another habit.
Well,
so it is a kind of the similar process.
You could say, but what's crucial here is it's not just simple, mix match.
No, not necessarily. I'm saying the energy is being spent on something else. Therefore, the focus on the shame or the shadow will be reduced. Therefore, gradually.
Right, but I mean, when we're replacing one shadow with one habit with another, like in other words, instead of having steak, I'll have salads. Well, or let's just say instead of having steak, I'm going to have salad, right? Okay. So you're replacing that kind of thing. That's behavior modification, etc. It's kind of like arithmetic. That's a very arithmetic, linear approach.
Okay.
I think on this level, within the psyche, it's logarithmic. The impact is much greater. That when you're actually connecting into something that is actually special to the person, it's not just another habit. It happens to be the thing that really is important to them. So for instance, that secretary, that officious, kind of Miss Cratchit, really nasty, vicious woman, or the person who she's being. If somehow one is able to find what was the thing, let's just say in her childhood, that she loved. Right?
Okay.
And if that was the thing that was activated, then you would find a quantum shift.
I agree with that part. The part that I have a little bit difficulty not to understand from the practical point of view, because when we are talking about adults, to access to that part of the psyche, it takes, first of all, willingness, and second, long process, like a psychotherapy or something like that.
Does not. No.
Or as we add, or there is another way of doing that, as we discussed about 3-4 weeks ago, that if immediately a shift in the public conscious, as a collective conscious, like war in some countries, or some revolution somewhere, or some sort of the disaster that impacts everyone. So that wake-up call, so to speak. So these are the two ways to do that. If you go, let's say, to that school, and let's say you said if the principal initiate that kind of the environment for this particular class, to create an environment for this particular class to can flourish in a different way, that is not very practical. It doesn't happen just every day, or does it?
Well, no. It doesn't happen every day because of all the reasons that we discussed of the whole system being self-reinforcing. But it doesn't mean that it can't happen.
Okay, how that can be?
Well, I'll give you that example. Okay. That time when I was, for instance, in Hungary, and I was doing the turnaround of a company. I'm sent in by the bank, in southern Hungary. And essentially it turns out that, what it turns out was that the whole thing was a massive fraud, and I was basically just being sent in not to turn around the company, but to keep the fraud going, where the people who were in charge essentially were just sucking money out of the company, and they just needed another covered so that they could actually suck out more, right? So I was just going to be another puppet in the chain. Okay, but what they have, a communist system essentially, which started out with this idea that now, instead of being just sort of serfs, because that's what they had in Hungary before, was essentially peasants or serfs who had no land or anything, and they just worked on the land, that now you start to have rights, that now the worker actually has rights. They started to have a period of actually believing that, and after that they found out that was a lie too, that it was just Russian occupation, just with another cover. And then, went back to another example of, just lying and cheating, taking what you can get, right?
Yeah.
No. Now, when I came into that company, I was that was in the early 90s. So the takeover was 45. So we're 45 years into this process, or at least, 48, 50. So let's say 40 years into this process of where they become completely cynical about the system, etc. So the people who were in there had grown up in that system, were born in that system, etc., right? Who were around the table. When I sat with the managers, when there was a demonstration, and I sat with the managers around the table. And it was about 1,000 employees, so there was probably about 25 managers, etc. Long table. We're all sitting around it, right? And as I was sitting around the table, I was just asking them sort of the simple question, what's going on, right? I'd been there for several months. I had high-level meetings, analysis, and everything like that. I'd come up with an idea of what was going on, etc. Technically, it was a shift from the communist economy, centrally controlled economy, into a liberalized market, blah, blah, blah. It all made sense what was happening. That's all true. The only problem was, the wonderful story was just bullshit, because underneath that, there was the real story, which is essentially this theft, etc.
Which comes back to those individuals.
Yeah, and these individuals and what was going on, but not just them. It turns out that I found out later that this was the same thing going on every company throughout, not just Hungary, but the whole previous communist system. And what really brought down the communist system was this massive corruption by that point, right? Not that whether it was a good system or a bad system, that's also debatable, but the fact was it became so corrupt that it really didn't matter, right? So as they're sucking all this out, and this is all happening. Now, what was key though was that in that room, while my actual action then was to simply have stood up, identified myself as not being representative of the nomenclature, that group, going to them and saying, I wish to understand, right? That was enough to initiate a process which now, within, minutes, a couple of hours, I ended up finding out everything about the company that I didn't come close to finding out in 3 months, right? But what also happened, and I only realized afterwards, was there was a complete shift in the energy field.
Among those managers.
That group, and this is a group who'd never experienced anything like this, right? So here they had experienced somebody who was not even in absolute power, because I wasn't being supported by the bank or anybody at that point, really. But it was they knew that I was sincere. That was the one thing they did know about me, that I was taking the risk and that I was authentic. And that activated that aspect in themselves, right? So in a sense, I went first. It opened them, invited them to follow. Those who had the capacity. Those who were braver, of course, started to speak first. Then other ones started to speak. And then, in fact, there was one I remember who left the room who was a spy who was representing the other side. So in a sense, it forced everything, like an astringent, it forced everything to come to the surface. But as I look back on it, what really was so simple was that what it really was doing was this event activated my nature. Like I had no plans to do this when I went to the company, etc. But it somehow forced me to dig deep into my nature and respond. My doing so activated that aspect of those people. And in an incredibly short period of time, things shifted. Now, very quickly, life happened. I was taken out, boom, 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 business as usual. And what happened afterwards was just more of the same, right? Just now it was with the capitalist flag rather than the communist flag, right? But the key was that whatever happened couldn't be completely undone. That what those people experienced, they couldn't unexperience, right? The seed is planted. Mm-hmm. And I would say that is the way. It's that. Ultimately, it's individuals who, despite everything, in a gesture, it could be an isolated gesture of giving, $5 to a homeless person, at a particular moment, but not in a mechanical way, going to 100 of them, giving them each $5 and expecting something to happen. No, at a certain moment, right?
Okay.
Where whatever it was, at that moment, you give that money, you have an interaction with that person, and that person, for whatever reason, despite all their experiences, is reconnected with that essential part of themselves, right?
Okay,
and I'd say that's where
the shadow part?
That's when you break past the shadow. That's the part where...
But it does not guarantee that if you are willing to get rid of that.
First of all, there's no guarantees.
No. I mean,
but also, actually, but it's never the same. That person is never the same. Once the person experiences that kind of moment...
So maybe it's just recognition of the shadow is the...
No, not the shadow. This is not the shadow. This is almost the recognition of what lies beyond. Because it's like the shadow is the thing that stops us from seeing that, right? So it's like...
So shadow by itself is not what you are talking about when you are talking about the fantasy and all of that. You're talking about
the fantasy actually
is the shadow of something that is more kind of the deeper than that?
I would say it's this. It's like what is that analogy of the prince who thinks he's a frog who thinks he's a prince, right?
Okay.
You know that analogy? So let's go to the first one. We think the problem with the narcissist is that underneath all the bravado they're feeding the world, they think they're frog. They're playing the prince,
which is the frog.
But they're hiding the fact that underneath they believe themselves to be a frog, right?
But behind that there is
another prince. But they can't reach the other prince because of that shadow.
So it comes back to the knowing self, the deep self.
But of course, exactly. This knowing self is a multi-layer, just like mindfulness, right?
Yeah.
Mindfulness is it's a process that as you start to enter it, it's endless because it just keeps going to another level. But it doesn't mean the fact that it's endless doesn't make it, doesn't invalidate
because
it.
there is no destination. It doesn't mean
there is no destination because it is its own destination, because what you find actually is its own reward. So you don't have to get to the truth in such, even though at the outset we actually look for the truth, right? Mm-hmm. It's only along the way that we gain a degree of wisdom that we realize that even this notion of a truth that we were looking for was already almost childish thinking. It's a very low level of concept. But at that level of consciousness, that's what it looks like, because that's all we're capable of. As we go to the next level, we realize, wow, that was just almost a kind of an abstraction that tricked us into going on this, but now we're actually going beyond that, right? And I think that's what it is. The shadow is not that interesting, right?
Shadow is that frog.
So an example is, if we were to take a look at the shadow as, okay, it's one thing to deny the shadow, then we're looking at the trooper. But now if we go into, let's say, the ultimate, the alpha player, right? The ultimate player out there, top, right? They're the ones who embrace the shadow, right? But they embrace the shadow in such a way that they just love it. They just engorge themselves in it, right? So if you watch a movie like, Eyes Wide Shut, and all those scenes, that's the embracing of the shadow, where they now are consumed by the shadow. Well, the problem is that's also a trick, because the thing is that they then don't get beyond that shadow because they're just so happy in that shadow. But of course, they're not happy in that shadow because that shadow is a trap.
Even if they're happy, it's just momentarily, and after the next night, they need more. They need more.
Because the whole thing
have to feed. It's like a drug.
That one exactly is the drug. So it's only the happiness of the addict, right? That's the ultimate addiction, and that's where power comes in, right? Because those people, what do they get off on ultimately is just power itself, right? Which is,
for pleasure.
No, but power, pleasure, but the only pleasure comes from power, which is really nothing. So it just keeps going and going and going, so that there becomes no intrinsic.
Like adding the dosage.
That's
higher,
exactly.
Yeah.
And what happens then is that they're depleting themselves and diminishing their capacity to actually reach that which is beyond it, until they just use themselves up. But the thing is, once you go beyond, and once you see that which lies beyond the shadow, right, which is the prince behind the frog, all of a sudden your shadow becomes who cares, really. Your silly fantasies, your things, whatever your stupid, whatever the person's, all of our own stupid idiocies are.
Yeah.
Because they always are they're ridiculously petty and small. They're not that big and they're not that important. And when we can actually laugh at them, right? And see it as actually more comical and stupid than, vile and terrible and disgusting, when it moves to that, then it actually just dissolves, right? It just disappears.
Well, last month, if you remember, we were talking about in one session about me with the bird and that footage of concentration that imprinted and tattooed in your mind for that.
Yes. It took a while to get it out.
Yeah. I don't know if you haven't managed that. Good for you. Some people haven't. But anyhow.
Another victim of concentration.
It's just nightmare. But regardless of, beside fun, but the reason that concentration created, that is exactly what you just described. Not with those words. I always said you have to go and see the foundation. And in order to get the foundation, you have to have investigative mind, which is mindfulness. And that investigative mind goes one by one to the issues that happen to you or memories that comes back, which goes back in compared to your fantasy. Because if someone has a fantasy of something, either sexual or otherwise, then they have to investigate that, why they have it, where it has started, what it gives them the pleasure, why they when they use it, how they use it, how often they use it. Those are the process of
What's the trigger,
what is the
etc.
trigger, which is the way in concentration was clearly outlined. I outlined based on my own experience. So that is why personally, based on what you said, I have no form of the reservation in any situation. Anyone can. Earlier before the show, you called me. People, without you saying anything about Nazi, they call you Nazi. So that is their problem. That is not my problem. But going back to the to this, for a person that who wants to get beyond that shadow, is there any practical way to do that? Or
Actually,
someone
you
has
know,
to have a trigger always?
No, but I was thinking, for instance, your med-centration is one way. I would say that really all the ways are similar in the sense that med-centration, I think, is a very, well laid out, intelligent process of mindfulness, right?
But it takes a long time to do that.
No, look, anything takes. It's funny. It takes a long time, but at the moment, but when it clicks in, it's a fast click.
Oh, of course, it's
but
like anything. The inertia has to become the
you have to
energy.
break free, and I think, is the answer? It's like every process is a difficult one, an arduous one.
No, my
because
question is
so much
mainly:
is at stake.
do you need the interaction or a third party to enter in your life,
Actually,
or is it like a self-imposed kind of or self-ignited?
It's just like
it's
like I guess it's just like yoga or anything like that. I mean, yes, in theory, you could probably figure out yoga by yourself, but if you happen to have, a wise and honest teacher, it certainly is helpful, So, especially in something like this, because where it's the mind, it's very, very easy to trick ourselves. So to have someone, and this is really the role of the good therapist,
in everything, daily,
even the
yes.
good psychiatrist, right? To the extent that they're, that they're really, or the priest, so let's just say the person who's the counselor, the mentor, to the extent that they're actually being authentic and not creating this, false dependence on them, etc., or representing the game in another form. When they're actually being authentic, then what they're doing is they are having that objectivity, and because of their own experience. And this is the thing too, is the only ones who can help you with this experience are the ones who've gone on the road before you, right? Mm-hmm. So if it is such a person who's gone on that road, well then essentially they're imparting their wisdom.
No, like a passing on the wisdom.
And it's a natural passing on of the wisdom. And yes, and I would say, in fact, you almost need that. Without that, it's extremely difficult.
And because at the beginning of this discussion, you mentioned, you started with the characteristic which is more common is in everybody, but more common in the trooper, and even to some, not to some extent, with the player, with the different use. How is this is different with this shadow, which is a wall that prohibits a person to understand what is behind that. How is different in the outsiders?
Okay, I would
because
say,
you said people
no, it's interesting.
Board,
So, so if we look at it this way, if we look at the trooper being the one who is most governed by the shadow, and the one who is so much in its, so terrified by it, that they're actually driven into the collective as a way of protecting themselves from it, right?
Which is a crowd mentality.
With the crowd, right? Then what you have is the player, the alpha player, who's just embraced it,
yes,
right? And so
live by it,
and actually became consumed by it, subsumed by it, right? when you have the outsider, I think what it is the outsider has the only one of the three, I think, that has a sense of what lies beyond the void, lies beyond the shadow.
Or at least there is something there.
I think exactly, but when I think that they think that there's something, it's more than just something.
No, I know,
think
but
they
they
believe-
know the shadow is not the answer.
First of all, they know there is something beyond.
Okay.
And they also have the sense of that which is beyond being something positive, right? Not something.
Oh,
yeah. That's what.
so they don't have the fear of the approaching.
No,
then.
but they're not sure.
Okay.
So it's a little bit like Hamlet's dilemma. When Hamlet sees the ghost,
Yeah.
yes, on the one hand, he's seeing the ghost, he's seeing all these things,
Yeah.
he's getting the truth of what
Yeah.
happened is that, his
Yeah.
mother has killed his
but
father.
his
but-
conscience doesn't let him to accept it
well,
as
but
a fact.
Well, exactly, because it's not certain. So there's the challenge, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd say that's very similar to the dilemma of the outsider. The outsider actually, on the one hand, is an innate sense of the truth, which they are more aware of than others, right?
Okay.
And that's what gives them the inspiration. It's the thing that stops them from buying in completely to the group, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the thing that always will keep them separate, even if they play along and become like the reluctant trooper.
Based on the
right?
necessity.
So that to some extent they can fall into becoming a reluctant trooper.
Yeah.
Right? But they ultimately have to resolve that. So for them, that need to resolve that becomes much more defined than for anybody else, because it's like I have this, and they can't forget it. So that means that they can't just completely just buy in, go in. I mean, and if they do, and they get drawn up too high into the game, for them it's an absolute psychic trauma, because for them they would just be ripping themselves apart
If they get to the game.
into the game,
Yeah,
too
yes,
far into the
yes,
game,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
If some, whatever through
Because
their
they
accounts,
have to forget about what they are really
exactly.
all about.
They would have to suppress that,
Yeah.
and so eventually, that's why I think you can see sometimes people who are like these great artists who just go up in the game, suddenly become so popular, and then they just implode. They just do something completely crazy and go to hell. It's because somehow psychically they had to pull themselves out, and in the end, this is the only thing they could do subconsciously is blow the whole thing up.
Chris, how are we doing?
8 minutes?
Yeah. Okay.
So I think that's where the outsider, in a sense, here is the one who for whom I would say they're the ones who have to resolve this. For them, it's
One way or another.
yeah, like it's well, ultimately.
no, but what I'm saying is
they have to
they-
come to terms with their
the same
essence.
as
Yeah.
players who embrace the shadow. These people want to get rid of the shadow and go the
Well,
beyond.
They want to go
Not
past.
get rid of the shadow.
No,
I
but
mean,
they- but they-
to pass beyond that.
But they need to pass beyond.
Yeah.
So they're fascinated.
This is
by
their
this- Yeah,
predisposition.
that's right. But at the same time, too, they can get
Because
caught.
you are under this belief system that this is something inherent. It's something
innate, yes.
innate. It's something that they came with it.
Exactly. Now, the thing is, in that quest to reach the Holy Grail, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they have to go through the dark fog,
Of course.
right? And they have to go through the shadow. And so what ends up happening also to them is that a lot of them can get caught up in the shadow and can get lost in the shadow.
How so? I mean,
Oh, they're all
how
egos.
is how is different than if an outsider get let's make this analogy that you are in point A and there is something in the other side of the mountain and you have to pass this mountain, or the sandstorm. Let's say sandstorm.
It's more like a sandstorm.
Shadow. Okay.
Yeah.
And this has a kilometer of the thickness, and you have to go that. But if they cut in that shadow,
Yeah.
is it the result is the same as players who embrace them, or the result will be completely different and fatal?
I would, is it different? I think it's quite similar, in the sense that the image is more the dark forest, right?
So they become
They get
part
lost.
of it.
They just get lost.
They get lost and become part of it.
Yeah, like an example, an artist. Let's say you look at someone.
Oh,
like,
then artists become famous and all of that.
yeah, or you look at someone like Dali. Now, I'm not an expert on Dali, but when you sort of look at, he's bending reality and he's twisting, and you sort of look at him and he becomes so. you wonder about someone like that, where it could be someone who got lost in that place. I don't know. Maybe he went beyond.
Well, his interviews, he's like talking like a narcissistic that.
No, but example, and this is the whole thing, is this narcissism is the
not
thing.
a talk of the artist.
Well, and this is the thing that becomes, I think, reinforced, is that you have to, unless you get past that narcissism, you won't get past the forest, right?
That is my point.
And so
yeah.
that's where, but the thing about it is, this is another thing too, that the outsider has a lot of narcissism too. So so each one has each has a challenge with their own narcissism, but it's a different kind of challenge. It's not that the outsider doesn't have their own narcissism.
No. Actually, they have.
They have.
How they get beyond that? That is
sure. Because at the same time, for the outsider, it is, here's this world that doesn't appreciate them, which is very easy. The natural path of least resistance for the outsider is to absolutely have contempt for the world, right? To hate the troopers, to dislike the troopers more than the players.
Yeah, because they have more mass, and they say, why they are not doing anything?
And because of the way that the treatment that they get from the troopers, right? The jealousy and all that, and the lack of recognition, and the desire to steal their gifts, etc., as perceived by the outsiders, right? So for them, they have to get over this rage towards the troopers. They have to get over this rage towards the players as well. So towards the game, for sure. Let's say, and if I were to speak about myself as an outsider, right? That then is also my crucible, what I have to get past. Because that would be the trap. Because if I got
even
caught in that,
with the bigger, it has even the...
Well, huge trap, because you'd be taking
much more challenging than the one that the player has, because player already accept what he is.
Well, yeah, but the problem with the player is that very, very rarely do the players get past this, right?
No. What I'm saying is, in comparison by the outsider that has to pass this narcissistic urge. To display of the urge for displaying this narcissistic
and I would say it actually
behavior.
There's a kind of revenge.
Yeah.
It would be for the outsider thinking about it now. I think it's a revenge, because having lived their life, having suffered the loneliness and everything that
this
every
is
outsider,
the time that I have to come out and show them that what I was and what they missed.
It's just because, you take a look at just, any of the great stories, the revenge stories, it's almost like now we're at the end of the story and what? We're going to just,
In fact, they
let
sell
the villain
this
do?
story sort of border, American Dream. You had nothing, and now you are... Yeah.
And part of the dream, too, is revenge. It's like, part of the fun that...
Now you have money, you have to show it off. Go after those people who oppressed you, suppressed you.
And give them their quote-unquote just desserts, right?
Yeah.
And all of this becomes, part of it. And the thing is that if they go and do that, and this is what's interesting, is that if any of the people had actually that story, they would be again subsumed back into the game. So that would be an example of a failed outsider who ultimately, at the very end, just when they were close to victory, ended up failing and was taken back into the game.
Instead of passing the shadow ate them.
Exactly. But the challenge at that point, once they're above, might be the greatest challenge of all.
That is why I said challenge for the outsider is much greater, because they are not familiar with the danger. They are not familiar with the shadow by itself, the same way that the players they are, that they embrace the.
Well, yeah, and I think also is that it's easier to resist suffering than it is to resist success.
Well, of course, especially if you have practice, because the outsider always have practice of the adversity. So all of a sudden they exposed to something that they never had experienced. So for them it's the first time.
Actually, it's true. I didn't think of it that way, but yes.
Are we close to the program? Thank you very much, John.
Thank you, Bob.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was our program for this Monday, 25th of April 2016. Please tune in next week, same place, same time, for the continuation of our discussion and find out what we can find beyond shadow. Good night.
Got my city, got my sin, got my baby, I'm rolling in. Well, she's gone, gone on high. I know she's lost, she's gonna die. Used to give me supper in a $5